My name is Jerry McMillan. I'm a UROP advisor, and I am going to be hosting this session. A couple of things before we start. A lot of times people come into these sessions and have questions about homework and assignments and things like that, and I know nothing about any of those. So if you have those sorts of questions, send an email to Anna, and she will answer them for you. Today we are having a panel of faculty members to talk about how they deal with undergrads, how you should deal with them, and the whole undergraduate research thing. We've got a few questions we're going to ask them. I'm also killing time because we have a third one coming in. But the thing I want you to do at this point is I've got questions I'm going to ask them. Hopefully at the end of that time, we're going to have time for you to ask some questions. So think about this is your opportunity to ask a faculty member about doing undergraduate research and how they react to it. Think about those questions, and if we don't answer it up front, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to ask it afterwards. And with that, I'm going to start by asking the two faculty who are here to introduce themselves, both name, your department, and what you like about working with undergrads.
You want to go first?
Sure. Can you hear me without the mic, or do you want me to use the mic? Raise your hands if you can't hear me, or if you want me to speak louder. My name is Judy Zijing Wu. I'm a professor of history and Asian American studies at UC Irvine. And oftentimes people don't know what Asian American studies is. They often associate with Asian studies, but it's a study of people who are of Asian ancestry in relationship to the United States. I'm also an associate dean in the School of Humanities. I direct the Humanities Center, and this year we're exploring the theme of care and repair. I also direct the Center for Liberation, Anti-Racism, and Belonging. We kind of switch back and forth between calling that CoLab and C-Lab. But that center is really trying to create a research justice university. So the types of questions that we ask and the research methodologies that we use and the ways that we're thinking about disseminating information is geared towards fostering social justice. I recently completed a book on the 1977 National Women's Conference, and that was a conference that was held in Houston, Texas. It was the first and only time the U.S. government gave money for and authorized the creation of a national women's agenda. And what I find really fascinating about it is that there's both international kind of connections as well as local connections. So internationally, in 1975, Mexico City hosted the United Nations International Women's Year Conference. And that allowed people from around the world to come together and talk about issues related to women's concerns. Inspired by that event in 1975, the United States said, let's host our own conference and have a national conversation about these issues. And instead of just a one-time event in Texas, there were 56 pre-conferences, one in every state and also in 6 territories. So a lot of people forget the United States is itself an empire and has territories in the Caribbean. Even Washington, D.C. does not have statehood status, as well as the Pacific. And these individuals gathered at the local level, including California. UC Irvine hosted a mini conference that was part of that process. And they came together and talked about what were the issues that were of concern for women in that time period. And California elected the largest delegation to go to Houston. So in my research, I focus on Asian American Pacific Islander women who participated in the conference. But the students I worked with actually helped to document the various delegates who went from California to Houston. And California not only had the largest delegation, it had one of the most diverse delegations in terms of racial diversity, class diversity, sexuality, so on and so forth. So it's been really fun working with students. In the humanities, it's a much more individual discipline. So oftentimes students will come to me because they have research questions and interests, and I'm happy to work with them, whatever it is that they're interested in engaging in. But in this instance, I formed a research team, and everybody, they were associated with a particular delegate, they did research. We also came together and talked about obstacles they were experiencing. We workshopped each other's writings, and there were multiple publications. One, we're contributing to a national digital humanities project at the University of Houston, and they're trying to document the entire conference across the entire nation. But also the students in California wanted to create their own website on the research that they've done, and so they've created that. And I've also authored essays with students, and actually one of them won an award most recently. So there's lots of different possibilities for you to be involved, whether you're from the humanities or just interested in some of these issues, regardless of your discipline. And I'll just say one last thing, which is I've really become interested in working with students who have creative ideas about research. So you may be interested in going into a particular discipline and really delving into that discipline and understanding the methodologies, the questions, the research outcomes of that discipline. But some students also have a creative, artistic aspect of their identities, and they want to explore that. So one of the projects I'm working on right now is a photography community, and we're trying to document instances of care and repair. And we're working with a professional photographer who's workshopping student artwork together and trying to figure out how we can create an exhibition together. I'll stop there.
So we're name, department, what sort of research you do, and what sort of research undergrads do with you.
Okay, awesome. So my name is V Dong, and I am in the chemistry department. Has anyone here heard of organic chemistry? Yeah, that's the course that I teach. And yeah, my lab also works in organic chemistry research. And the way I like to describe it is, as a kid, my favorite toy were Lego building blocks. And then when I took OChem, I realized that everything around us is actually made out of Lego building blocks as well. Just like four key ones: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Those 4 building blocks make up the food you eat, your clothes, the fuel that you drove your cars, powered your cars, the medicines that we take. And so that's kind of what my group does. We design molecular architecture, develop the tools to build bonds. So the undergraduates that are in my group are also engaged in that research. Like they'll come up with, their experiments, they run them in the fume hood and just see what happens. And so they kind of work side by side with the graduate students, investigating new ways to make bonds, basically.
Great, thanks, V. So you guys know me. Research is not usually just female dominated here. We actually had 2 other panelists, both males, try to add a little more diversity in different fields, psychology. We tried to expand out, but they both were sick. So I'm coming in as the pinch hitter. So you guys know me. My name is Michelle Kine. I'm a professor in biomedical engineering. Last week when I talked to you guys, I was super excited because I just had lunch with a Nobel Prize laureate. That Nobel Prize laureate was V's advisor. So Nobel Prize is like, you guys, who watched the Super Bowl on Sunday? Hey. It's like a bigger deal than, the quarterback who won the Super Bowl. It's that big a deal. So when you get into research, right, like you could do things like that. There was that opportunity to make like breakthrough discoveries like V has. And I was excited to invite V because she actually was an undergrad here and got started in research here. And now she's a professor here. So I thought that was really cool. Anyway, my research, I got into doing research also when I was an undergraduate student. I'm also an associate dean for undergraduate education, so I oversee Europe. I am excited to work with undergraduate students because I think they bring a fresh and exciting perspective and energy to the lab. They work closely with my graduate students. Some of them are papers. I've had first authors as undergraduate students. They basically write their tickets to grad school. We make sensors in our lab, so it's very much a maker's lab. We make all types of sensors for various applications. So if you guys like to use your hands a lot, build things, that's basically what we do in my lab.
And I have to thank Michelle because my PhD advisor was here, the Nobel laureate, and then he said he wanted to go to the UCI Hawaii basketball game. And I was like, okay, how are we going to get him tickets? And I contacted Michelle, and she managed to get him VIP tickets through the vice chancellor. So Michelle's a good person to know.
So let's start with a fairly, I hope, easy one. What do you look for in an undergraduate researcher? What do you want to see from somebody who's coming to you wanting to do research with you? And we can alter the order we do this however you want to do it.
Do you want to begin?
Oh, why don't you guys go first? They hear a lot from me.
Okay, so I do think like sometimes when you're an undergrad, you feel like this pressure to send an email that says all my qualifications and how I'm going to come in and make an impact on your research program and be such a valuable asset. And actually, I tend to not look for that because I think it's like I'm looking for the student who more has the attitude of like, hey, I really like this subject. I'm really excited to learn, ask questions. I'm curious about it. We don't really expect the students to come in and be superstar hotshot researchers that are gonna like save our program. In fact, it's very, very rare. I've never really seen that happen. I think it's more common to, do well in classes and then come in and realize research is really messy, you struggle, you make a lot of mistakes, things don't always work, but you kind of develop that grit and resilience. And so, yeah, I would say like when contacting professors, I think don't feel that pressure to make yourself sound like you're this like genius who's going to come into their lab and like contribute a lot, but rather from the perspective of like, I'm just really curious about your work and I want to learn and I'm willing to like work hard and ask a lot of questions.
So from what it sounds like, you prefer those who are willing to take the initiative to step out and out of their comfort zone, kind of?
Yeah, versus someone who might be thinking like, I already know this stuff well. I'm going to come here to contribute to your program, and here's my qualifications. You know what I mean? It's, I think, a little bit different from other kinds of jobs where we really don't expect you to know anything about it because it's very different from what you've learned in the classroom. And so maybe just kind of having that sort of like, I'm really excited to learn attitude is what would resonate better. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. In terms of, well, first of all, I think research is really important, not only because I really enjoy it, but it's also about discovering new knowledge, right? Because I think a lot of your experiences as students is that you're maybe sitting in classrooms, learning from people who are experts, and then demonstrating that you have mastery of that information that's being passed along. But we're all engaged in this process of discovering new ways of thinking about the world around us. And so I think that's kind of the essence of what it means to be part of a research university. So to transition from being a student to becoming a creator of knowledge or a creator of something, a new way of thinking about the way we live or the way we see the world around us. So in terms of how you make contact with professors, when you take classes, even when you take large lecture classes, you might take time and just go talk to the professor, preferably after, because maybe sometimes before they're a little bit stressed trying to get everything ready. Go visit them during office hours, introduce yourselves. I remember the students who come up to me after my large lecture classes, and they might just walk with me as I leave the classroom. Let people know that you're interested in this process of being involved in research. Email them, look at their websites, get a sense of what their research projects are like. Think of, to communicate with them about why those particular people, those particular professors are the ones that you think you will most benefit from having a research learning experience from. So those are some just additional things for you to consider. But as professors, I think most of us are really open to having student contact. That's why we're here at the university. So take those opportunities to talk to people, take those opportunities to engage with them, office hours, after classes, email, and so on.
Yeah, do you want to kind of highlight what you said in terms of being at UCI? As an undergraduate here, I would say being part of the research group was probably the best part of my education because to some degree, right, we're like Irvine, you're in really large classes and it's not, like a liberal arts school where you have like that contact with your professor. But once you enter a research program, it's almost like you've got like a set of mentors that are almost personal. Like you really get to know your research advisor. You have graduate students that you interact with, and it completely changed my educational experience. And I think like being at UCI, that's like one of the biggest advantages is it is a research institution, and there's so many exciting things happening all around. So definitely encourage you to think about that because it is like this extra thing that you have to do, right? You're probably looking at your schedule and already like, you've got so many classes, clubs, activities, like how do you and why should you fit research into it? But I think it's really, really worthwhile. And it's one of those things like whatever you put in, you kind of get back like in multiplied, right, amounts. Like it's kind of incredible. It also changed my perspective on courses. Like once I started entering research, the classes all made more sense. Like I understood better like what I was learning and how I could apply it. And so it was just incredible having mentors that you can interact with on that level. And I don't think you can quite get that from classes.
Yeah. So just to add on that, I think that's absolutely all true. I think that so what I look for in a student, I tell my lab that I can teach almost any skill. The one thing I cannot teach is that self-drive, that motivation, and that determination. So I have students who, right, they want to know an answer right away, but if they don't, they just kind of like fall apart. They're not comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think in research, you have to be uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, right? You have to live in that wanting to know why, right? And to keep digging. And so even in getting into my lab, the big joke in my lab for like the last 10 years was that I'm phenomenally bad at answering emails. Phenomenally bad. I have probably like 50,000 emails that are still unread in my inbox. So don't take it personally if I don't reply to your emails. The way people get into my lab, I don't know why I'm telling everyone this, but the people who have gotten into my lab, they figure out my schedule by talking to the current students in my lab because they know how to get a hold of me. They're on Slack with me. They have my cell phone numbers, and they map out my schedule, and they start following me until I have that opportunity to talk with them. And those are the people who really impress me, right? Because they're creative enough to figure out where my schedule is, and then they're determined enough to actually stalk me. So I'm kind of flattered, and also it's really hard to shake somebody off and say no to them at their face when they keep following you around. So don't do it in a creepy way, but I really do like that determination, right? It's more than just sending out a random email and then, you don't get anything in return, you move on, right? Like it shows that you are committed and you really want to learn. And it really, I have students working in the lab, and some of them, and it's been an issue. I was, complaining to V last week. It's really been an issue, I think, since COVID. Like, I don't feel like this connection with the students anymore. That's what you want, right? When you teach a class, you don't want everyone just staring at their laptops and, not interacting. You want somebody to come up to you after class. Like, that feels good when somebody, like, has that human connection. They ask questions in class. So those are the students you want to take, right? The students who are actually excited by what you say, who are interested in working with you, because that faculty-student relationship is really powerful. These are relationships I have, like, for my entire life. I am, you keep in touch with your advisors. Even what was remarkable about V's PhD advisor, who won a Nobel Prize, he came back and he was, like, so respectful to his UCI professor that he got his PhD from. It's a lifelong relationship that you have. I keep in touch with my undergraduate students from 15 years ago. Like, my students come back and they visit, and you want that lifelong relationship, right? It's like building a family. And so you want these people who are going to be excited, who want to be in your lab. You don't want to just be like pulling teeth. So those are the types of people I look for in my lab.
It's kind of incredible too. I think just the fact that you're sitting in this room today, you already have like a huge insight and advantage, because when I was an undergrad, I didn't realize how important it was. Actually, I was just so busy taking my classes, and I remember one of my TAs said, "Hey, you did well in this class, OChem, like, why don't you do research with Larry Overman?" And he was the PhD advisor of Dave McMillan, who's the Nobel laureate. And at the time, I had no idea that was even a thing that you can do. And he was very surprised. He thought, because Overman was so well known in his field, he thought the undergraduates would be like lining up at his door trying to get into his lab, but it wasn't really the case. I think a lot of students don't realize, like, it's actually a pretty cool opportunity. If you can get into someone's research lab, you've got this lifelong connection, this network that you're a part of. And the undergraduate students who worked in my lab, like Hillary, she just accepted a job, like, a 6-figure job in San Diego, and she's designing and inventing new medicines for Janssen, right? So, like, I see the undergraduates through all the way till they land that kind of dream position, still be writing letters for them and things like that. So it's kind of, I think the opportunity is totally here at Irvine. Like, I think we can all speak to these office hours that we hold where nobody shows up, right? And like, if you just like take that little bit of extra effort to show up to an office hour, make a connection with your professor, right? You can kind of open up a lot of experiences that you wouldn't have, and it's not like so competitive, I think, to get in.
Especially
right?
now, post-COVID. I feel like the bar's really low now, so you guys are like, it's a good time for you guys.
Just, you don't even have to stalk Michelle.
Also, for people who may not feel very comfortable interacting with people, I think most of us are introverts. I think that's why we're in academia. So don't feel like you have to go in with this kind of spiel and performance. I mean, I think just this authentic interest is something that really gets communicated.
And I think that leads to another question I was going to ask. Part of the reason we have these wonderful people here is to kind of humanize faculty for all of you. But something we hear a lot that I want each of you to speak to, why shouldn't students be terrified to talk to you? Okay, maybe.
Actually, I have to admit, I was terrified to talk to my professors. As a first generation college student, and in my mind, professors were like, not somebody you could talk to. And I also think you feel pressure, right? You're thinking, if I go to office hours, I better have some really good questions and be able to sound really intelligent when I engage in this conversation, right? And so I think we have a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves as students and to interact with professors. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think you shouldn't worry so much about that, right? Just showing that interest and showing that you are really curious. It's that's okay, right? You don't have to have. I think office hours can be intimidating, and actually some of my colleagues have tried to change the name of it to study hall or something where it's not like you think you're going to go and engage in this debate with your professor. So, but maybe you guys should tell us how we can make it less intimidating. I'm not really sure. I think that's my current hypothesis is why it's kind of hard for students. Maybe having Zoom office hours, things like that, make it a little bit easier. But
I've definitely had students come in together, not necessarily planned, but they just all happened to be in my office at the same time. And so we could have collective conversations, and I think that's interesting as well. So maybe bring a buddy or bring some people from the class, and you can come in together. I don't know, I was laughing because I don't think of myself as very intimidating. But I can understand, just given the age difference and given status differences, that people might perceive this big gap. But, we were all undergrads, and I just remember being so transformed as well by my undergraduate research experience. And I think, for me, I really love being around universities because I'm around younger people. And there's just such an interest in life. There's different ways that you see the world. And I'm interested in learning from you. So I think other professors are in a very similar position.
yeah. I think it's a great attitude. And I mean, to answer your question, I think to some extent it's also our faults. The professors are intimidating sometimes. You feel like you're bothering them, right? You ask them a question and they're kind of okay, that's in the syllabus, right? And then you're kind of okay, maybe I shouldn't bother this person. So it's definitely a two-way process in that I do think to some extent, professors are really busy and they might not be so approachable sometimes. So it's a mix. I don't think it's just the students, actually. I think some of our colleagues are actually pretty intimidating. Yeah. So
I likewise laugh because I didn't know what you meant by that either. I'm like, how are we intimidating? And, we talk about imposter syndrome, and I remember distinctly when I was younger having imposter syndrome, but I don't remember, it feels so foreign to me to now have imposter syndrome, right? I was like, what is that feeling? Until I was just when am I ever intimidated? And meeting Dave McMillan was the only time I felt I'm meeting a Nobel Prize laureate. So I get that it could be intimidating, but I don't really I don't think of myself as a scary person. My 5-year-old really doesn't think of me as a scary person, so it's weird to think of why it would be intimidating. I'd love to hear from you guys as to what it is specifically that we do that is intimidating, and then maybe we could talk about strategies around it, because I don't really fully get that anymore.
Any quick thoughts on why professors are scary? Or is it too scary to say so?
There are a couple of hands over here, too.
I got one here.
Oh, well, I think one mentioned it earlier, but I feel if you go to office hours, I feel the need, I have to have a good conversation with the professors. I have to bring a bunch of well thought out questions, which I don't particularly have.
So having to prepare questions, well thought out conversation.
it feels like it's a one-on-one exam, maybe. Yeah.
I've had students just come and ask more about my own journey, like my professional journey or my personal journey. So you could just, to kind of go along with the theme of humanizing, just to learn a little bit more about the person who's your professor, right? You're going to meet with them 2 or 3 times a week for 10 weeks, like get to know them a little bit more and what motivates them. So I think that's a good opening question. I think if there's a reason as to why you want to get to know them better, I think that's good to open with, right? Is it something about the way that they're approaching the subject matter, or the types of research questions that they tend to ask? Or I think it's just interesting who's in the room, right? And I think Michelle's comment about, the 3 of us representing UCI, right? We're kind of an unusual demographic for representing professors. And so if you're thinking about also role models, right, academic role models, that's a really important set of questions as well.
There was other ideas on.
I think it's also because we kind of hold you guys on a pedestal kind of sort of way.
It's funny. Look at how we're sitting. We're like elevating ourselves.
It's kind of like you guys are untouchable in that sense, but because it's like, it's not that we idolize you guys, but it's like you guys know your material. So it's like, we feel like we have to come prepared to know what exact questions we have to ask and kind of like leave an impression on you guys. But it's also, I think it's also like the office hours. It's like when we go by ourselves, it is a scary like moment, because it's like, okay, is this a dumb question? Is this even a good enough question to ask? Is it just me not understanding the material? So I think like when you guys were referring earlier to like being able to switch the name to a study hall, I think that's much more friendlier and welcoming in that sense. And kind of leaves you with the impression of like, oh no, it's an environment where I can actually ask these sort of questions.
Yeah, it's kind of up to us to say to you, hey, you don't have to have good questions, just show up, we'll just study together, and if something pops up, right, to make it less of a, okay, if you have a great question, come ask me. Yeah. Did you have a suggestion as well?
I think I would agree with her as well. I think, especially when it comes to trying to ask research questions, I believe you really I believe the fear kind of comes from your competency in expressing what you know about that subject, especially if you're trying to get into it. There's a high barrier of entry that I believe is just kind of hard to really gauge how much you should know and how much you can kind of get away with just asking and trying to get into their research.
Definitely. I actually still remember a question asked a professor at office. I was like asking them a question, and they said, that question's like beneath me, like I don't answer those kind of questions. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't have asked that. So I do think there is, like, you're trying to figure out what's a good question and what's like just so simple that you shouldn't be bothering them. So yeah, I think it is kind of on us to make office hours and things less intimidating.
I was going to say that I think coming up with a good research question is a process. So oftentimes students will come to me and say, I'm interested in this topic area. And sometimes it's so vast that I feel like, I don't think you're going to be able to do this like within 4 years, right? Maybe, especially if it's a 1-year process, like what's something that's a little bit more contained that we can specifically address. And so that's a conversation that we have. Not only one time, but the student's going to go back and look at other people's scholarship and refine and fine tune, so that it's not something that you kind of come forth, it's already well prepared. And so I think that's part of understanding what the research process is about, right? Being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and asking a series of questions that might lead you eventually to what you think you can actually try to address. And part of that process is also through your readings, right? Through the lectures, through the readings, how have other researchers approached this particular investigation? What are their research questions? What were they able to actually answer, and what did they leave unanswered? Or maybe what was about their answer that was not satisfactory for you, right? So it is a process, it's iteration. And so don't be afraid thinking like, okay, I don't have the perfect research question, because I think none of us really, right? It's a process that we have to go through ourselves to figure out what it is that we're trying to discover.
Yeah, and I think also, like, if you want to challenge yourself with it and not be afraid of being embarrassed or, like, failing, like, you can use your professors as an experiment, right? You can just be like, every quarter I'm going to go into that office and have a discussion with this professor, and maybe it'll go great or maybe it won't go great, but you're going to grow and learn so much from it. And just imagine how much better you'll be at interviews, right? For, like, med school or dental school. It's just like that, they're right there, right? You can just use that opportunity. Like, can I read up on something a little bit, go and have a conversation? Let's see how it goes. And I bet you every time you do that, you actually learn and grow and, like, get yourself out of that comfort zone, and you get better at it. And by the time you're a senior, you can, right? They're not going to be intimidating anymore. So, I mean, in some ways, maybe just taking that risk allows you to have, like, a really unique educational experience that a lot of your peers aren't doing, because they're just kind of like, I don't know if I want to put this extra effort in to go to an office hour, right? Even with my own graduate students, they can be pretty intimidated asking professors questions. So I have, like, a 30-minute session every week where when a new professor comes in, like, we had a Berkeley professor, Richmond Sarpong, coming in, and I had all my students meet with him and then ask him questions and then present him at the board. And I remember in the early days of that, the students were very intimidated. They were, like, quiet. Nobody wanted to ask anything. But after doing it a few times, you just kind of like, hey, it's not really a big deal. I'm still alive. I survived it. And so maybe, think about that as a fun challenge, because you might not even know if somebody's a good mentor for you unless you do that, right? You might be like, oh, I'm going to apply to Michelle and stalk her to get a position. But maybe just like, if you meet all of your professors in that one-on-one setting, there'll be some that you really resonate with, and you're like, I could see myself having this person as a mentor. And then maybe some others that you're like, that conversation didn't really go well. I can't imagine working with that person for, like, a whole year, right? So I think that could be a good way to get started, and it can also help you figure out what you're really interested in, because you don't know at this stage, right? I don't think I completely know either, even now, right? Like, there's always something new to learn and explore, and so you don't have to have it figured out. Maybe just kind of, in some ways, the research mindset is be experimental, right? And be willing to kind of take a risk, see what happens.
So this is really therapeutic for me. I kept thinking that students just don't like me anymore. So, and imagine all those poor professors who sit there in office hour thinking, well, students just don't like me. They're not coming to my office hours. Like, we don't think of ourselves as intimidating. So this is actually enlightening to me, because, like, that just, that actually didn't cross my mind until Jerry said that. I really was wondering why my students, I keep asking them, I'm like, especially with students working in my lab, I want them to meet with me every week, one-on-one, and they haven't been doing that. I'm like, why aren't you doing that? And I just want to talk with them. I don't need updates all the time. I just went out for boba with one of my students right before this. Like, I just want to check in to see how they're doing, and that's, we just want to see that you're trying. I don't need results every week, right? Like, so I think that you just have to, I think V's right. Like, go in there and practice, right? You already have a leg up compared to everyone else in your peer group, because you're going to those office hours. You're putting yourself out there, and you're already making a good impression because other people are not sitting in that uncomfortableness and talking to a professor. You made that professor's day, because that poor professor's not lonely sitting in office hours waiting for somebody to walk through their door.
Save one professor every quarter.
And you get to practice your interviewing skills.
There's a professor at UCI named Barbara Sarnecka who's invented a method of teaching writing, which I found really empowering. And it's geared primarily towards faculty and graduate students, but maybe it will be of interest to undergraduates as well. She has a whole series of resources called the Writing Project. And she talks about how we often hear about each other's successes, but we don't hear about each other's rejections, right? And we all have faced rejections. Like, we have submitted articles that don't get accepted, or we'll apply for different grants that don't get accepted, but you don't hear about that. You only hear about the Nobel Prize winners, right? And so I think it's really important to be aware that people face rejection, people experience failure. And what she has is something called a rejection collection. So everybody puts in their rejections, and when you get to 100 rejections, she throws a party for everybody, right? And it's to make visible the effort that it takes to try to submit, as opposed to feeling like, oh, did I get it? Can I just not tell anybody until I get something, right? And so she's trying to validate the effort that you put into writing, submitting, trying to keep, always trying to improve your own work. So I think that's a really great mentality to have, because there's only so much that you can control, but what you can't control is the effort that you put into the project.
Yeah, I think it's kind of amazing. Like, there's a professor at MIT. He's really famous now, but he actually failed his oral exam when he was a PhD student. And I was thinking about this idea of like, it's not really how many times you fail, right? It's just that you just have to get up one more time than you fail. And in some ways, like if you can embrace that mentality at UCI, it almost makes you a little bit fearless, and you can try to just fail more often and quickly, right? And then just keep going forward from it. So, try to embrace that unknown. And there's actually a really interesting book called Rejection Proof. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but it's about this guy who goes out and he purposely seeks rejection. And so he just goes and asks people random things and waits for them to reject him. But surprisingly, I don't know, check it out. It's really wild. Some of the things that people say yes to. Like he wanted a bunch of donuts in the shape of Olympic rings, and the person actually made them for him. And then he was like, he got all these things that he never thought he could get, but it made him rejection proof. Like he became like fearless in pursuing things.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to move on to questions. You've been raising your hand a lot, so I'll get to you first. But just for all three of you, before we quit, after we get some questions, I'm going to ask each of you in one sentence or less what you want them all to remember as they walk out of here from hearing from you. Yeah.
Is there like certain notes that students cannot do, like when they approach professors?
I'm sorry?
Like, is there a certain like no, like what students cannot do when they approach professors?
Oh, like turnoffs, like things that you should not do.
Yeah, what should students not do in approaching professors?
Well, we're human beings. So, like, think about how you would want to be approached by someone that you don't know, right? And I think there's also certain expectations for female professors in particular to kind of go the extra mile, to mentor, to nurture, which I am inclined to do, but it's also a lot of emotional labor as well, right? So think about how you would like to be, how you would like those interactions to take place, and just be cognizant of that, I think.
Anything on this side of the room? Questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, like, did you know going into undergrad what you wanted to pursue, or was research kind of like taking a hand in that? Or did you have like an aha moment during research?
Did you know?
Did you know going in what you wanted to do?
No. So I'm Chinese American. Some of the three possible professional paths that were available to me, according to my parents, were being a doctor, being an engineer, or being, at the last possible, choice, being a lawyer. And I decided to be an English major for a while. And then I became part of a student protest effort to try to create a more welcoming, nurturing environment, especially for students of color on my campus. And that led me to thinking about issues of history and power and equality. And following that engagement, social activism, I did research about the 1960s and 1970s in San Francisco Chinatown to learn about the social activists who were there that were trying to transform that society. So both that political engagement and that research experience led me eventually to academia. But I did not know going in.
So my parents really, I'm Vietnamese American, and my parents really wanted me to be a pharmacist, because they're like, not so stressful as a doctor, but just really right level of
Prestige.
Yeah.
And security.
You should be a pharmacist. And so I was like, okay, I guess. But I started off as an ecology major. And then I wasn't really sure. I thought maybe something in the health sciences. And after I took organic chemistry, it really was like, oh, this is such a cool subject. And so I kind of moved in that direction and ended up being like a chemistry professor. But I do remember my parents just kind of like, when are you going to get a real job? Like going to grad school? What? And then another thing of training. And it was just kind of like, I think they're finally understanding, okay, I see what she tried to do here. But I think it was like hard to sometimes break out of what your parents' expectations of you are and like what your role is, right? Like you said, because it's like every Vietnamese family wants their daughter to be a pharmacist, I think.
Yeah, very similar story. So Asian parents wanted me to be a doctor. I was pre-med and mechanical engineering, and I was a transfer student to Cal. And in mechanical engineering back then, there was, less than a handful of women in my class. There was, out of a class of 50, there was like 4 women in my class. And my very first friend that I made there, I used to study with her, and she was working in a lab, and she said, hey, my lab's really cool. You should come work in the lab with me. So come meet my professor. And he was awesome. And I ended up studying the impact response of the human torso to Taekwondo kicks. How cool is this? And more than just that, he made it a family environment. He invited us out for barbecues. We hung out with the grad students. It became a little family. And I'm like, I still am really, really good friends with my best friend from college. And she's a professor now in London. But, it was really cool. And then I discovered, because I was pre-med also, that I don't really like humans. I don't like that interaction. I hate germs. I'm a germaphobe. So med school really wasn't a good option for me. So I decided to stay and buy time by doing my PhD, because if I'm doing my PhD, my parents can't complain that I don't know what I'm doing with my life. So I stayed, and then I was in engineering. So I was literally the only woman in my lab in engineering, and I had a really exceptional advisor, and he was like, I think you should be a professor someday when you graduate, and you should start thinking about this. And he encouraged me to apply for my first faculty position, and I ended up getting a faculty job when I was getting ready to graduate. And then I ended up I did 3 years at the University of California, Merced. I started there, and then I moved down here in 2009 as the first female professor in biomedical engineering. So this is, to me, is really astounding, having 3 women out of 3 panelists up here. So just, and we're changing that. But I think that, finding, and this was part of the reason for putting together something like this. I don't want people to get into research by because you're lucky, it's happenstance, right? You happen to have a friend who works in a lab, or you have parents who know that they should be telling you to do research, right? Like that doesn't seem very fair to me. So I want you guys to have this opportunity, because this is why you come to an R1 university, is to get in to do research, is to be able to see if you like these different fields instead of just out of a textbook, right? Like you get to live the work that will someday be in textbooks. So that to me is exciting. But no, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And my research changes. Like every few years you have to keep up, right? It changes every few years. I started developing sensors because when my son was born 5 years ago, he was born with a collapsed lung, and then I discovered that there was actually no sensors that measure respiration continuously. So I'm like, well, let's make one of those. So that's how I started getting into digital health. So I think that your research, your interest is really it drives what your research focus is.
So, looking at the clock, final thoughts, Michelle.
Well, you guys are taking the first right step, I think, in doing this class. I encourage you guys to get out of your comfort zone and to stay out of your comfort zone. Talk to professors, talk to other people, talk to folks who are happy in labs, right? This is a relationship you're building. So you want to work with people that you actually enjoy working with. So find out who are the cool professors to work for and who are kind of the ones you should stay away from, right? And figure out and try things on, and don't be afraid of rejection. I think that's a great superpower. If you're not afraid of failure, you're not afraid of rejection, imagine how limitless you can be.
Yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, there's so much that I could share. I would say 2 things. One is, I do think there's an amazing number of books out there, and in some ways, like I've benefited so much from just learning from books, right? Because my parents didn't go to college, and if I wanted to learn how to be a writer, I would just get a book on writing, or get a book on public speaking, or get a book on And it's like all there, out there, available. Like there's literally a book called How to Get Straight A's in College. If you want to get straight A's in college, read the book. Look at the Amazon reviews. All the students are like, yeah, this totally worked for me, right? And so in this book, How to Get Straight A's in College, Cal Newport says, I think a really counterintuitive piece of advice, and it's don't follow your passion. Instead, ask, what can I do that will contribute to society? I think that's a very, very different question, because in some ways we're taught, oh, follow your passion, and then you're thinking, I should just love studying for biology or love this, and sometimes the stuff that you're doing actually isn't so fun, especially when you get into research. It can be tedious and boring and messy. But if you can ask yourself, like, what is it that I can do? What are my unique things that I can contribute to society? It's a very different question, and that will allow you to power through the boring stuff, the tedious stuff, so that you can get to that point where you are using your talents to contribute. So that would be my advice to you. Kind of flip that question around and think about how can I contribute to society, and then pursue that.
I love the life wisdom. So I was gonna say, be adventurous, be brave, and have fun.
Have fun. What a great way to finish. Thank you all for joining us and sharing the wisdom and the experience.